Return to Nantucket Part 1 is the third episode of the first season of Wings. And as always, there will be spoilers from this point on as I discuss things about this episode. And it's certainly a roller coaster of an episode. It feels a little bit too soon, to be honest, because this focuses on Bryan's relationship with Carol. And it feels like we needed more time. But I don't dislike the episode, just as an observation. I feel like it could have worked better later on. But having said that, we are now halfway through the first season. It was a very, very short first season. And it starts off with some delays because the plane is broken, at least the Sandpiper airplane is broken. And then a guy called Danny, a friend of Bryan's, played by William Bumiller. I apologise if I've mispronounced that. And he reveals that he actually bumped into Carol recently. And it turns out that Carol, of course, Carol being Bryan's ex and also Joe's ex once upon a time, she's actually moving to London. And Bryan goes against policy and finds out information about which flight she's on. And it turns out she's having a 4-hour layover in Boston. And he phones to leave a message to meet her at the top of the Prudential building. And unfortunately, not only is the Sandpiper plane broken, but there's also a thick fog around Nantucket. And it means that theoretically, the planes can't leave the ground. But Bryan is desperate because he thinks this is his last chance to, in his mind, win Carol back. And as I said, this is one of the reasons why I feel it's too soon for this episode. I feel like we need to get to know Bryan as an individual before he starts to try and get back with Carol. But again, it works well enough as an episode. I just think it would have been better if it had been further on in the season, maybe even another season down the line. But obviously a second season at this stage was never guaranteed, so fair enough. And because he is desperate, he risks his life, really, and takes the plane out. And I think there is definitely a great sense of desperation with Bryan. His love of Carol is still so apparent. He still feels like he needs her, he depends on her. This is very obvious in this episode, and I think it definitely tells us a lot about Bryan's character. It also tells us a lot about Joe and Helen, as Helen realizes once the fog is lifted, she needs to go after Bryan to help pick up the pieces, basically, and Joe asks if she wants company. And it was just a brief moment where we have this nice moment between Joe and Helen. But of course, he's really going for his brother's sake. And they go off to the Prudential building, and we have a brilliantly written exchange, primarily with Bryan and then with Joe. And this involves a cab driver called Luther, played by Cy Richardson, who has come along to deliver some flowers to Bryan that Carol has sent. Obviously, Bryan's devastated that Carol has got on her flight to London. She hasn't met him, but sending flowers means that she still thinks of him. And she sent a nice message that Luther delivers, and it was well enough written, but then once they start interacting as if Luther is Carol, I think it worked really, really well. Obviously, this could have been quite an emotional scene as Bryan is heartbroken, but they managed to get a really good amount of comedy in there, and things feel a little bit slower as well. Up until this point, in his desperation, everything had been so quick, but now it's time to let the dust settle, accept the situation as it is, and bring some humour in there as well. And at this point, it seems strange that it's a two-parter. How could they possibly extend this beyond this episode? But of course, something that I think is very unexpected happens in the last 20 seconds, maybe, not even 20 seconds. And of course, this is a huge spoiler, as I said. In the last, let's say, 10-15 seconds, the elevator doors open and Carol is standing there. And she's played by Kim Johnson Ulrich. And I don't think anybody watching this would have expected that to happen. It's definitely a shock. And the expression on Joe and Bryan and Helen's faces at that moment, they're just brilliant. And it's definitely a shocking way to end this first part. And absolutely explains why there's a second part. It also helps to explain kind of why the title is Return to Nantucket, because obviously Bryan's meeting her in Boston. What's the relevance of Nantucket? I won't explain, of course, but we have part 2 coming up. And sometimes with sitcoms, I feel like two-parters just don't need to be two-parters, but this one, absolutely, for that shock, that surprise factor, it worked so well. So really enjoyed this first part, of course, and I do remember the second part relatively well. I don't remember a lot of the jokes in Wings and a lot of the humour, but I do remember a lot of the narratives and the overarching stories. So I know that I know what to expect, but I won't say any more than that. For now, part one of Return to Nantucket is a real roller coaster and a very brilliantly written, quite funny episode.